This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's it, everybody. We are back, and this is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is titled Our Biggest Projects, How We Became Web Developers, or How We Became Developers, more specifically. So in this episode, we're going to sort of showcase some of our biggest projects. Some things we can share, some things we can't. So some of the details may be anonymized or like slightly changed for that anonymization, just to let you know. However, we're going to talk about how these big projects shaped basically our developer pathway, if you will, and how we became the developers that we are now. Because obviously Mike and I are in, similar but different roles, as tech has a lot of, I guess you could say, nuance or variance per title. Like a developer is like, you're a developer of what? Mobile games, mobile apps? Do you just work on, are you a database architect? What do you mean? Like developer of what? And so there's a lot of nuance there. And so we're going to kind of talk about how our pathway kind of came to be. And I think something that we want to showcase in the show too, and Mike actually wrote this episode mostly, so I'll hand it off to him in a moment. But one of the things that we want to kind of showcase in this episode, I think, is that a lot of people will actually ask us, have DM'd us, how do you become a developer? Like, what's the path? What's this and that? And there's certainly cookie cutter ways to do it. I think it's possibly dated now, but we have like roadmap episodes and things like that. But usually it's pretty unique. Like the pathway is usually fairly unique. It's usually something like, you fell into development or you fell into an IT role and they really needed a developer and, that story goes on. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. Now, Mike, like I said, you wrote the majority of this episode, so I'm going to let you take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, like Matt mentioned, the episode really is about a certain path that we took, and especially it told through projects. So I think as you get in your career as a web developer, the thing that really projects you forward and the thing that you're used to learn really from the start is project building. So this is going to be our path told through the milestone, quote unquote, projects that we built throughout our career that defined where we are today as developers. Okay. So it's not going to cover every single project that we ever built. It's going to cover the biggest ones, the ones that not even like some of the big ones we're going to leave out, the ones that didn't like work out, the ones that didn't go to the right path. These are the ones that really pushed us to the next step. So each one is like a career defining moment for us. And we learned a lot. We had a lot of challenges in each one, so we're going to talk very in-depthly about those. And, each one had different technology as well. So we'll talk about the decisions we kind of had to go through and what we had to do. And my hope is, again, for someone coming into the industry, wondering how they're going to look in like 10 years, right? What they're going to be doing in 10 years. I hope that this will give you a little bit of an indication in like what you might build, what kind of challenges you might come across, what your career might look like from a project perspective, like what you might be working on. Obviously, some of these are going to be dated. So like the first project we're going to be talking about is 2014. That was 10 years ago now, actually, which is kind of crazy, Matt. We started, I guess our business started in 2014, 2013. And yeah, it's been 10 years of doing this. So obviously your projects might differ, but I bet you the challenges will be kind of the same. I bet you your learnings will be very similar. And hearing someone else's path, I think, helps democratize and, demystify the journey, right? Like, I think it's important to share it because if you never heard another path, or if you only heard a couple and you're like, I could never do that. Well, our path is pretty straightforward. I don't know, like none of these projects that we built are revolutionary. None of these projects that we built changed the world. They were just websites, web apps. They were cool to certain degrees. They were challenging in other degrees. But we became where we are today by just going through and really focusing and building projects. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in this episode.
I would like to point one thing out too, just to add to your comments, is that we had one or two like extremely negative experiences that we're just not going to cover in this episode because it would just end up being a lot of complaining. When we were writing the actual show notes for this, we started talking about those projects and immediately just started complaining. Now, the reason why I mentioned that is not to sort of, get your pity or anything. What it means is that some of the, like, these are our highlights, like Mike said, these are like our greatest hits, if you will. However, what you kind of have to realize is that some of your projects that are your quote unquote greatest hits are just bad. And so don't say, take all our projects, which are mostly successes, if not all successes in this list, and think that all your projects need to be a success. Some things that shape you are bad projects, and they can shape things like your policies if you're running like a freelance agency, maybe change your pricing, or realistically, or maybe change your life. Like you might just say, I hate this stuff and I'm going to go do something else. And that could happen too. So I wanted to just kind of throw that in almost like an asterisk and say, all the projects we're mentioning here are not every single greatest hit. The negative ones, which you don't want to hear us drone on about, will shape you too. And I'm sure you'll have your fair share of those within your career, depending on how long you're in the industry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point. And, some people might want to hear about our negative ones. And I think it is important to talk about them, but I think that's going to be a different episode if we ever do it. If you want to hear about our like disaster experiences, let us know. We've mentioned them here and there throughout on the podcast. We've been very deliberate in not like droning on about them because they were pretty hectic and stressful. But if it's something that you think is going to benefit you, let us know at HTML Everything on X or Twitter, at HTML Things on Threads and Instagram. Reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll figure out a way to tell those stories in a non-damaging way to the customers and clients we work with. I guess that's really the limitation that we have to kind of work around, is we don't want to disparage the people regardless of how we were treated or whatever. We still don't want to publicly, disparage people. So, well, with that, thanks, Matt, for that little caveat, because it's very important. 2014, this is when it all started. This was our first kind of, I would say, big project. We had a couple projects before that were of, significant size, but nothing too big. This one was significantly bigger. It was a massive website for a medical clinic in Russia, of all places. So I'm Russian. I'm from there. I don't go back there anymore for obvious reasons. But regardless, I have still a family there. This was a family member. They needed a site for their medical clinic that they run. And we were brought in because I just got into the industry. It was a good opportunity for us to make a little bit of money and learn a bunch of things. The website seemed to be in our wheelhouse at the time. And it was just a good opportunity, I think. Now, what it was like, if you go to a typical medical website, you'll see, pages about every service that they offer. You'll see pages with about us, with every doctor that they have, a page for each doctor to just explain who they are as people. You'll have pricing charts. Those are really important at the time. That was like a legally mandated thing at the time, I think. I don't know if it is now, but the pricing was super important. It had to be consistently updated with the real pricing and stuff like that. And we had testimonials. And the reason I say we had testimonials was because somehow the testimonials were the thing that kind of broke the camel's back. And I'll be talking a little bit about that in the challenges section, but they were a challenge. What we used, the technology that we used for this one, was just straight HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That was what we started with on this. We bought a template. It was a decent template. We all agreed on it, including the stakeholders of the project. They liked it, and we're like, okay, we need to adjust it here and there. And, we didn't have too much experience, but we knew how to adjust the template. That wasn't a huge deal for us. And with that, we kind of, had all our planning sessions with the team. And Matt and I just went off and distributed the work and built. I think we did a ton of time just building out every page, making sure it looked good, adding in all the content that they sent us over from their old site and new content and stuff like that. And we built a fairly significantly large, at least for us at the time, website with a lot of components in it. So what did we learn through all this? We learned a ton of vanilla fundamentals. We preached a lot from the very beginning of this podcast. the three pillars. Well, we started with the three pillars. We started just plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, no jQuery, nothing. And with this project, I don't think we touched anything other than those three things for a little while, and I'll explain in a second. But then obviously we had to manipulate a template. That was a whole skill that we had to learn. It's not super straightforward because templates are fairly convoluted sometimes because they have to adapt and support many different variations. So that was one thing we had to do. The other complication was internationalization between Russian and English. That was a thing we had to kind of learn. We didn't implement a very good version of internationalization. It was essentially two separate sites almost. And the English site was almost never updated after we left it. So that was, it was a learning, but it wasn't a great implementation. We did cross time zone communication. So this was our first foray into chatting with people, across the sea. This was in 2014, not super common, I would say, like to work in that kind of long distance. This was more of like because I had family connections, we just kind of had to accommodate. But honestly, later on in life, it's definitely helped because I've had to, even today, have to chat with people from Australia, have to chat with people from China, have to chat with people from everywhere in the world, all across time zones and accommodate different schedules. So this was a really good learning from that I kind of took on for the rest of my career right from that point. Did a ton of project management stuff, because we had to hit deadlines, so we had to learn some project, we had to, create a board, we had to put tasks on a board, we had to figure stuff out. We didn't use Agile or anything like that. There was no methodology. We were just well, these are the tasks we need to complete to finish this project. And Matt and I just went off and did them. But we definitely had to do that because there was just a lot to do. And the last thing here, and something I haven't mentioned yet, is Couch CMS integration. So initially I mentioned we only did HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Well, due to some issues that arose with the fact that we had to actually update the site daily and sometimes multiple times a day, initially when we set out to build the site, we kind of pitched it to them as, hey, for this price, you're going to get a static site. And then if you want, you can pay us monthly and we'll just update the site for you, weekly or whatever. And they wanted to do that because for them, that would be easier, just sending us an email with a bunch of updates and we would just update the site. It made sense at the time. Looking back, hindsight 2020, terrible idea. Awful idea. We should have known many red flags just from a learnings perspective. We had updating pricing, which was mandatory by government. So that was a huge red flag that we should have picked up on, being hey, that's something we need a CMS for. We shouldn't be the ones updating your pricing if it's mandated by the government. You should be able to go in there at any second and update the price at any second without having to wait for a 24-hour turnaround time. Big red flag, dumb, learning, big learning. The other red flag was, hey, we have testimonials coming in daily. So we need to update the site with testimonials. And we were thinking well, how many testimonials could you possibly have? Surprisingly a lot. I don't know what it was, but initially when we launched, I was literally on the phone with them daily trying to adjust testimonials and put testimonials. I don't know what was going on, but we were getting testimonials like crazy. And I was doing a ton of custom testimonial adding that shouldn't have been happening. It should have been all in the CMS. So long story short, after probably 4 months of pure chaos of 2 a.m. calls, we were told that, hey, this won't work. We can't do this. We need to figure out a way to integrate a CMS. And to be fair on them, they were very fair with us in the sense that hey, we agreed on no CMS. So now we need to requote them with an additional budget to add the CMS. And Matt and I went off, did a bunch of research, found Couch CMS, integrated Couch into the project. That was our first foray into Couch CMS, integrating a CMS into an already existing website. That was a whole thing that we've never done before, never considered. Using Couch CMS, whole thing to learn, right? Integration and supporting that whole process. So I don't know if I can't remember if you remember. I don't know if you remember, Matt. I believe the CMS integration took almost just as much time as the actual build out of the website because of the complication, but we eventually did get it done and allowed them to be able to do all the updates that we were doing manually for 4 months.
Well, I think one thing that we really should touch on is that, obviously this is our first project, but this isn't our first project having come out of school with a bunch of web development knowledge. This is our first project in which we were kind of brute forcing it. We had kind of practiced or trained ourselves a little bit into what HTML, CSS, and JS was. And we were aware that, maybe we'll have to use WordPress here and there. And I had installed WordPress for personal and professional projects in the past, but nothing quite as in depth as this. So when I say like, or when you say, this is just HTML, CSS, and JS, is like, yeah, but we even weren't really sure what we were doing yet. Like we go in and it's like, why is this text wrapping? I'm unaware that there's a text wrap property. So I'm trying to like set widths, and everything I'm doing is just trial and error to learn CSS effectively, like live on the job, which is obviously not the greatest thing in the world. There's lots of sites, I mean, possibly even then, but there's lots of sites now where you can do practice projects. There's good, just suggestions on like, let's, try building these projects out and things like that. Or, take a UI that you like YouTube or something, and just, remake it for yourself just to sort of practice your skills in HTML and CSS. And we did none of that type of thing. So like everything was brute force. So then when you add Couch CMS, it's sort of like, okay, like how does this plug in? What are the parts? This kind of like weirdly goes back to that conversation I had where when you're dealing with a family member that's completely unaware of what's going on and you're their IT and you're like, hey, change the input on the TV, and they're completely unaware that there's different set-top boxes and different boxes do different things, and there's different ports on the TV. They're completely unaware of that. We were at like that stage, but with websites. So when, Couch CMS, in theory now, like what I think of Couch CMS, actually, I just recently built out a huge feature for someone in Couch CMS, but just like 3 weeks ago. But when you don't have any idea where things plug in, where you put things, how things generally work, let alone the hosting and stuff, I mean, it was pretty chaotic. So yeah, like I would confirm that Couch CMS took, either equal amount of time or more time than the rest of the stuff, because admittedly, it was an HTML and CSS mostly template. And a lot of it, you just go in and you change the thing that says, hello to the name of your business, right? Or like sample text, and you take that and you just change that. We were aware of that, but the instant things needed to be changed, it's like, like things need to be changed. Like this is a mess.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like to the challenges section right now, one thing I didn't add, which I should have added, is that the challenge was everything. Like every part of this was a huge challenge because of what Matt just mentioned. Like this was our first big project. This was our first like brute forcing of like learning skills that would happen later on even more. But like on the job, I've learned probably 80% of what I know now on the job, being paid to learn it. That's probably not an exaggeration in any way, shape, or form. And that's probably going to be the reality for a lot of people. Matt mentioned a good thing, like, before you get a job or before you jump into a client project, maybe it makes sense to do a little bit more prep than we did. 2014 was a little bit of a different time. There was less material to learn from. There was, we had this opportunity to kind of a low stakes way to get into the industry, and we took it, and we got lucky that we were able to complete it and, get a decent review and all that. Like we got through the project. It was not easy in any way, shape, or form. And we learned a ton we learned a ton of things in that first project that we still use today, which I think is a very interesting outcome of that. If we were like scared back then of the stuff that we didn't know, we would have not have taken it 100%, because there was a lot we didn't know as we went through it. So that was number one big challenge. Didn't know anything, right? Number two big challenge was the time zone. So I say that it was the first time we worked on it as like the huge time zone difference. I'm not joking when I had, days upon days in a row of meetings at 2 a.m. That was a consistent thing for me.
I completely forgot about that. I know the time zone difference was big, but I forgot it was so drastic.
Yeah, it was absolutely brutal. And it was like intense meetings of like, okay, we need to move this here. We need to add these testimonials immediately. Why isn't this working? And then like, especially the CMS planning sessions were all crazy. Like all of those were just super early, like, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. for me. And that was rough. And after that, I was like, I'm done with it. If we're working with a cross time zone, they're accommodating, we're compromising, like because this was our first project, there was no compromising. I was just like, I'll do whatever you want, whatever time works for you. Like that was not. After that project, it never happened again. I never did that type of compromise on my own. I will always meet someone in the middle. So like I'll do late night, like, 8 p.m., 9 p.m. every once in a while. Like that's not a problem for me, but I will not do middle of the night meetings. I just don't see a benefit to that for me at this point in my career. But again, First project, didn't know better, was a grind.
The thing too with 2014 is you are in the sort of infancy of work from home. Like, you have to remember that 2014 is a time period in which like BlackBerries were still prominent and like we're kind of on their downfall in terms of like device usage. Like, it was a different time, right? Like, if you look at the design language even of smartphones, like smartphones are a really good, for this particular time, smartphones are a really good gauge of where tech's at, because like the design language is so different. Like, they've plateaued now, but back then it was like new stuff. And 2014, probably 2004 to 2014, right? Like a 10-year period, and maybe even later, right? Like, I'm not giving exact dates, but this was a time period. The point I'm trying to reach is this was a time period in which it was kind of thought, more or less, you can answer emails, you can answer phone calls, but like on the go, but you do meetings in person. And you book boardrooms for meetings, and you do that. So this is a much different time. And so like async work, which is what would help you a lot, Mike, was very much sort of in its infancy. And if you brought it up, people wouldn't even really know what you meant. And people were certainly doing async work without really realizing it, with the rise of email on phones, with the rise of whatever, which was, prior to this, like before 2014, people were doing async work without really thinking about it. But again, it was very much like I mentioned, I have this thing I say sometimes to my friends when we're talking about old tech, where you very much did your computing at your desk. You very much went to the family computer or went to your work computer, went to your office, home office, whatever. And if you wanted to do something in your house, you like did it at the desk. And 2014, maybe a few years prior, is the beginning, the very beginning of people being like, hey, I could, bring this phone with me and I could remote in, or like, I'm going to bring this tablet with me. And so some of that stuff is still being developed right now. So it's still very much it was a different time is the point, right? And also I'd like to point out that on top of it being a different time, we talk very fluently, Mike and I do, on client stuff. We talk about scope creep. We talk about, we need to requote. We talk very fluently also to clients about things like, hey, internationalization or localization, whatever you want to call it, is not easy. Like, it's an expensive feature, especially when you start talking about, and this is something we never did, but there's a very big difference between localization of language and localization of content. And especially if you do a mix of that starts getting very messy. So back at that time, it was very common, like Mike, you mentioned, we had two separate sites for the English and the thing. It was like, in our research at the time, it was like 50-50. Like, about 50% of the advice was, yeah, just do separate sites. And when we figured that out, we're like, well, that just makes sense then. Like, why wouldn't you just do two separate sites? It's easier on us. It seems to be, a standard of some sort. So why wouldn't you? And again, I keep mentioning it was a different time. There were still major websites in 2014 that had an M or a mobile subdomain, where the mobile site was running a completely different site. Because you have to remember, again, like I mentioned BlackBerries before, people, if you had an old phone in 2014, like, your screen size was like 2 inches, 2.5 inches across, 3 inches. Like, this is a different time. And big phones started to pick up, of course, right? Bigger phones started to pick up. But there were people out there that had phones with like full keyboards, and Android phones too, full keyboards, very small screens. Dumb phones, or whatever you want to call them, were still very present. Resistive touch was just kind of like leaving, like had just kind of left the building at this point. 2 years prior, resistive touch was considered old, right? Like, this is it's so weird to look back on this now, because it's just like, it's almost like a history lesson. Like, 2014 is the beginning of really like the environment we enjoy today in a way.
100%. Yeah. And we had a lot of the old stuff that we had to accommodate. Like, the Flexbox was not a thing that was supported by everyone at that time.
No,
just flat
certainly
out.
not.
Yeah, so we were like block model, whatever you want to call it, all the way. So that was another challenge that we had to go through. But everyone had to go through at that time. But with that, so 2014 rolls around, we completed that. I would say that was a success, a very difficult success, but a success on multiple levels. Again, the learnings that we had, the challenges that we went through, and I think it gave us a lot of confidence that we could do bigger projects. But after that, we did a few more kind of projects, and then we're like, oh, hold up, we need to skill up. We were at a crossroads where we're like, well, do we want to continue doing these random marketing websites, or do we want to start doing apps? right? Like maybe we want to do something bigger, but we don't have the skills. Like Matt and I just did not have the skills at the time to do that. So we went down this road of, hey, let's, Chrome extensions are big. Chrome apps are getting bigger. Maybe we should go and build a couple of extensions in Chrome apps and, specialize in a niche. We were told like niche down to try to promote yourselves. And that's what we did. So in 2016, after having already built, I think, at least one successful Chrome extension, we decided to create a Chrome app game called Clicks to Riches. We've talked about this on the podcast a bunch of times. Probably you can go back to 2016. I believe we started recording the podcast shortly after this or during this. I can't remember, but I believe you can hear us talking about it like in almost live terms where we're building this. But we met with a designer, like one of Matt's friends was brought in to help like do all the art for the game and the game direction and stuff like that. And Matt and I built this game in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And we were very adamant about not using external libraries, external tools, external frameworks. We wanted to learn the pillars of web development, and this was our kind of canvas to learn that on. And we made a clicker game called Clicks to Riches that you start off as a beggar, and then you clicked your way to, becoming a king. And obviously there was ways to do auto-clicking and upgrade your clicks and get more people clicking for you. And then there was also an endgame plus system. It was a fairly robust clicker game for people that have never built a game before in general. Like we've never, or even really done complex JavaScript at the time. Like this was a pretty big step from like to-do list essentially to an entire platform game. And it was fairly successful. From a Chrome app perspective, we got on the front page of the Chrome Web Store. We were featured there for a while. It was a $1 game. We had sales at $1 on Chrome apps of all things. Not a lot, but we did. We had some sales and we had some reviews. It was a pretty big step from zero to that for us. And it got us into this Chrome app niche at the time. And what we learned from that, obviously, was Chrome app development, which was big. We worked with a slightly larger team. Like it wasn't just Matt and I, it was Matt and I and a designer. And that throws quite a bit kink into the mix. We learned crunch. We had a very short deadline that we set for ourselves. I can't remember if you remember it, Matt, but I think it was like 3 weeks. Like it was something crazy.
It was something crazy. Yeah, it was like, because we wanted to just get it done. Like my buddy had just come out of college and he was kind of looking to do something, for a portfolio piece. And, honorable mention, like we were planning on building a bigger game with him, but that never ended up happening. But I mean, at least this thing got completed.
Yeah, exactly. At least it got completed and it was completely out and everything like that. So yeah, huge honorable mention to him. He was actually really fun to work with. So there was quite a bit of crunch because of the 3 weeks. So we learned a little bit about crunching, a bit about like working overtime and all that. Working with a very complex static layout. That's something we learned from this. Like, a game forces you to be very constrained. Like responsiveness isn't really a thing in this kind of world. You want to have everything kind of look exactly the same on all screen sizes or just not work on certain screen sizes and stuff like that. We did a bunch of math, gamification math. There was like a whole spreadsheet that I had where I was calculating out like the different tiers of like going from beggar to king and making it so that each one is harder but not impossible. That was a whole thing. And then the last thing here is digital marketing and advertising. We learned a bunch about that because, again, we had to post it on the Chrome Web Store. We had to market it, post it on Reddit, I don't remember exactly where we posted it. But
we got picked up by a local outlet, like a local development house outlet that covers, literally software in Hamilton at the time.
That's right. Exactly.
So like we got covered by them.
Yeah.
Which was kind of cool.
Yeah. We got some decent, like from nothing, we got something pretty good and we learned a lot. Like this was definitely a milestone project for us. We think back on it constantly being like, we should build something like that again because we have way more skills now and we just don't have the time. So it's something that we want to do again and we probably will do again, but it's definitely something that set us on another path forward. Some of the challenges, again, set tight deadlines. That was tough. Like, I remember we were at my house in my basement just working 8-9 hours a day and then just going to sleep and then coming back and working 8-9 hours a day several times. We had many disagreements, figuring out like different ways to move forward in the game, like different game decisions that, we had to figure out those disagreements and move forward quickly because we didn't have time to argue. Like, we had to just build. So like any disagreement was like, okay, we just yell at each other and then figure it out. Autosaving and syncing were a kind of a pain, I would say. Like, they were something that I had no experience with. And like, Chrome apps allow you to sync with your Google account when you're logged in. And so like figuring that whole local storage syncing thing up was a challenge. Like, it was like, for me at the time, I just didn't have the experience to just be able to do it easily. Now it'll be a bit easier, but like then it was definitely a huge challenge. And then our decision to not use a framework for any sort of the UI control and just doing everything in pure JavaScript, not even jQuery, made it so that our code was pretty messy in terms of like manipulating the UI in certain intervals, to the point where it was very difficult to adapt and change. So there was one thing that I wanted to do. I wanted to take the app and just port it to a website at some point. And I had a ton of trouble doing that. I never finished it because, again, ran out of time. But like, just taking it away from the Chrome extension side and putting it into a website was a huge challenge, because all of our code was like pretty messily written, and some of it had to be pretty specifically written for how Chrome apps handle local storage. And that in itself was a thing that kind of made it difficult to port. So it was definitely messy code to get the job done. But yeah, I don't know. I guess the other challenge would be just the UI stuff, Matt, right? Like, making the UI all static was probably fairly difficult. I didn't work on a lot on the UI. That was Matt. So like, yeah, that was probably another thing that was actually really difficult.
It was fairly difficult, especially since we were, a couple years into just doing responsive websites, and you're doing everything vanilla. So like, you're messing with stuff and you want to make it look good. You can't just have things sort of, pop out and look bad. So I think we had some animations and things like that. And I remember like learning at that point, like, oh, you can't just like display none, then display block and have it fade in. You have to actually like have it like having that trigger from none to displaying something like flex or whatever is causing it to just sort of like jolt appear, like just sort of like boom, in like one frame it like appears. So we had to like mess with some of that. I don't even remember really how many things we animated or like what like ended up in the actual like full game. But we had like other weird things too, I remember. So we had like a big button, like it's a clicker game. So you click this big button, and the big button, wasn't very fun to click. So that was another big thing, is like you would get the UI working, and then you would kind of have like that game problem where you're like, uh-oh, this isn't very fun. This isn't very interactive. This isn't very animated. And then, so we said, okay, well, why don't we go, and we sourced out some like a little coin bag image asset. And we had this thing where like every time you clicked, you would make money. So then we had like it pop up. But the problem was, it was like, uh-oh, well, it's popping up randomly within this zone, but now it's interrupting the clicks. So then we have to like figure out how to make it appear, because in the past on most websites, if it's, not really supposed to be there, you either don't display it or you display it like under the button, right? You use the Z index. In this case, it's like, well, it needs to be there so you could see it, but we don't want the user, like, we want the user's click to go through this little pop-up to still hit the button. Like, the button is the key thing of the game. And so we had to mess with that. You already mentioned this other thing, but I remember this is like, we had tons and tons of arguments. This is outside of the UI though. We had tons of arguments over the progression of the game, specifically how long it was supposed to take. Cause like, I was like, well, hey, we had a mechanic where if you closed it on Monday and then you open the game on Friday, it would calculate that your passive income, whatever rate, would work. Like, it would give you the passive income for the 5 days. We had tons of arguments over how fast you were supposed to reach stuff. And then we ended up actually expanding the game. So we went from like, I think we wanted to finish it in a week, but then it just wasn't very fun. So then we expanded it to the 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it was. And we ended up adding like a prestige system where you like go through, like literally you go through the whole game, which I think we got working in the first week. And then we added like a prestige system. So there was like 10 prestiges. If you know Call of Duty, it's basically like you restart the game again, but you have certain things left over. So it was inspired actually by a venture capitalist with, at the time, I know that game's been updated, a bunch, but back at the time, it was sort of like you would quote unquote prestige with angel investors, so that you would start with like, I think it was like a certain amount of income. So we would do like a thing where it's like, okay, I can't remember the parameters anymore, but it was like, you're making $1 million, a day. Let's prestige you, and then you'll passively keep 200,000 a day. And the goal, and like really the goal of that is A, you can climb the ranks. And B, if I remember this correctly, B is that if you, like, let's say your maximum potential was the million a day. Well, now you could, on your second playthrough, still make $1 million a day, and you'd also have $1.2 million now. So then the next time you go through, now it'd be like $1.4 million or like whatever it was. So that was another big thing, was we just, like, you mentioned it before, but the big spreadsheet you had where we had to like figure out, like, okay, if a person, like, this is a real thing, if people are playing at a certain amount, how fast are they getting through this? Like, are they getting through this in like 10 minutes? They also have to see progression, but then there's also passive. So if the game is really quick to beat actively, then the passive means nothing and the passive becomes useless. So we should encourage the use of passive by them hitting a wall. But at what point do they hit a wall? Do they hit a wall 10 minutes in? They're probably going to uninstall. So do we hit a wall like a day in? Like, what do we have to hit? Like, it was a big thing. And so you ended up building some sort of algorithm where we could adjust it. So like we would go in and do and be like, nah, that doesn't feel right. Okay, we want you to like, hit tier 1 at 2 days. So you would literally go into your spreadsheet, fill in the number 2, hit enter, it would like, do a bunch of calculations, and then it would like refill out everything so you could go into your code and change all your variables and everything. I mean, that's cool though. Like, that's a cool like thing to need, because at this point, like with websites, a lot of the stuff is obviously, subjective, it's visual, but there is a lot of sort of like things where you can kind of push back on with clients, where you can say like, hey, your budget's 2,000, you want this thing to fly around the room in 3D, that's going to take another 2,000, right? And then oftentimes that pushback or that, notification will then prompt them to drop that feature. But we're making this game. We're not making this game for a client. So we need the game to be fun. And so therefore, we're not going to release a game that isn't fun, And we got some complaints. Like, this is just a clicker game. It's like, well, yeah. Yes, it is. I understand the limitations of a clicker game being fun. It's not the next, Elder Scrolls game, certainly. So I don't know, like it was a cool game. Like, again, just like I mentioned, how we now fluidly speak in sort of client relations with the clinic app or the clinic website that we had mentioned earlier. We learned a bunch of stuff where we now realize, like, okay, like UX is important, having something come up to you by a client. So having them bring something to you like, hey, we should put music in, or we should have the buttons be all like this. You can just go in and more or less shut that down. That's not going to be fun. That's not going to be good. That's not going to be easy to click. That's going to look bad or be hard to interact with on a touch screen specifically, things like that. And so what this project did for me anyway, is it really specifically taught me there's a lot to a project beyond the technical part. Like, the technical part reflects the project. So the project has to be planned well. And even when you plan well, there's going to be problems. So you better plan well, or else it's going to be an even bigger mess, because it's always a mess to an extent. And then the last thing was the responsivity, where making it responsive was just like almost impossible, because we had so many, like our big problem is all of our graphics were made, but they weren't SVGs, they were just made. So then it's like, okay, well, let's stretch this div. Well, the browser is not, generating a box for us with a border, and it can, stretch indefinitely. And stretch and shrink for that matter. But we have a problem now. We have a problem with, if we want this thing to go on mobile, and then therefore we want it to be portrait, well, will the stuff fit width-wise? And like, what does that look like? It was, this was a big project. Like, a lot of stuff was, discussed, a lot of stuff that moved around, and it was a cool project, but it was a lot, but it taught us a lot.
I'm kind of shocked because there's a review from July 18th, 2024 on Clicks to Riches.
Oh my God.
Extremely well-made game, but it can definitely be improved further. 5 stars.
The game is almost 10 years old.
It's a clicker game too. I mean, okay, so
someone paid us 99 cents.
No, it's not. We put it for free. We put it for free after a year.
Right.
After the first year, we made it free. But regardless, so I don't want to toot our own horns here, but we did do a really good job at our first game, regardless if it was clicker game or not. It taught us a ton of things moving forward, and it's still something we want to come back to. So it's a good project when it's something you want to come back to. That's the thing. Or like, just in general, the concept of making a game is something we want to come back to. So with that, the next stepping stone for us, the next project that this led to pretty much, right? Like, was a project for a company called Content Link. We don't work for them anymore, just like out of transparency, but it was a small startup that did optical retail marketing. Optical retail as in like glasses stores, like stores that sell regular glasses, sunglasses, whatever. And this company, they were creating a digital asset manager. So like a server where anyone could store marketing material. And then they were creating a marketing media player where you could put like a tablet or a computer. At the time, it was Chrome OS, hence why we were brought in. It was a Chrome OS computer, and it would display marketing content from the digital asset manager that you could update at any time, right? So anyone from the optical retail store could go in online, update their content, and it would automatically show on the computer, marketing display. And we were brought in, again, because we built that Chrome app, and we had some experience doing Chrome apps and Chrome extensions. We were on like a freelancing site, and they contacted us anyway. And this was built, again, because we had all the experience with it, and it was already kind of started in this way. It was built with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Eventually, we did bring in some jQuery because there was a lot more intricacies involved in this project than any other one that we worked on before. The digital asset manager was all in PHP. We didn't touch it much on our side. We didn't touch the actual like server side. Most of our work here was still very front end. And then the other technology that we were using for this one was Cordova, which is a cross-platform package thing where you can take a regular web application, package it, and make it display as a web view in a native iOS or Android application. This was our first time working with a small startup, which was a pretty big experience for us. The project already kind of existed, so they had a very basic MVP that they wanted to take and make better into a more robust platform. So we were brought in to like take it to the next step. And again, most of the digital asset manager stuff was handled by the team that was already there. So what we learned, a ton, agile project management practices. This is where sprints really began for me. We did regular, daily stand-ups. We did the Jira board, talked to the Jira board stuff. We did sprint planning sessions. Like we did agile project management in its very technical, typical definition. And yeah, I learned a ton from that perspective. The mentor, like the CTO, was a ex Intuit QuickBooks developer. So they had a lot of experience in corporate software development. So that was where I learned a lot of my management techniques, a lot of my, development skills. We actually had him on the show, like in our first few months of the podcast, Azar. So you can kind of go back and take a look at that podcast. I haven't listened to it in forever. I wonder if I kind of want to go back and listen to it. But anyway, so that was a really fun time for me to learn a bunch of stuff. I think, Matt, you were also part of the project during this time. We were both working on it together, which was also really fun for me. And yeah, there was a ton of other stuff. So jQuery, we hadn't really touched jQuery at the time, so I had to learn it from scratch there. Video playback stuff, that was a big pain, which I had to learn, was really interesting. And then again, building on the game, I had to learn a lot more local storage hacks, because what the project demanded was the material, like the video material and the image material, needs to play without loading. So what I did was a lot of preloading of the images and videos, compressed images and videos, into local storage, and then I would play on the devices from local storage directly, so that you weren't hitting the network every single time you were cycling through a image or a video. Yeah, the challenges for this one were cross-platform development, obviously. So that one was a whole new thing for us. We'd never built an iOS or Android app at the time, and that was a pretty big challenge, honestly. Like, this was another one of those situations where if we had known the complexities before going into this project, I don't know if we would have taken it on because of our lack of knowledge here. But we managed to still grind through it, figure out how it worked, make a ton of mistakes, honestly, and actually develop a pretty good application that ran on Android devices at the time. When we switched from Chrome OS to Android, this was like a big decision process, because we couldn't source enough Chrome OS devices. That was honestly the reason. Like, we couldn't get a bulk shipment of Chrome desktops. We could only get a bulk shipment of like cheap Android devices. And because it was cheap Android devices, they were really bad. And this was, again, 2016, 2017, when Android was already bad. And like put on top of that really shitty devices. And so like building long-running applications for really crappy Android devices taught me that it is, first of all, really difficult. That was a huge challenge, but it taught me like, hey, JavaScript can be written this way, but it's not meant for that. Like JavaScript's not meant for running 12 hours a day on a crappy Android device in a container. Just not meant for it, period. So there was a lot of hacks I had to do to make it run. I had to like auto restart the devices every day. I had to purge the caches. I had to like there was a bunch of stuff we had to do to make it so that it had a fairly high success rate. And that was not standard practice by any means. There was no like guides to how to do that. That was just trial and error.
Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes. Well, I would like to actually throw something in there is that realistically speaking, like we were using the Android browser, of which the Android browser at the time was not Chrome. It was like browser, like it's Android, right? Like at the time, it was literally just called browser. It was sort of, especially on these devices, it was probably out of date. And then you also had the nuance of like, okay, in Cordova, we're going to use like an in-app browser for something. And that was a question mark of like, is it using the web view, which is Android? Is it using the latest browser? Because sometimes the web view was like, let's just say version 1, and the browser is version 1.2. So now it's like, okay, now we're using a feature that we know works in testing, but then this device's web view sort of framework or how it does it is different. And then you're also like, there's a lot of hardware stuff here, right? Like not only are you logistically shipping out tablets, moving tablets around, but you're also worrying about like, okay, are these things going to be updated? If one of these things fail, do we keep some on hand? Like there's a lot of nuance there with the hardware, not only the software running on the hardware, but also the hardware angle as well. And so it was a big, like that's a big question mark. It's more than just, here's your website, enjoy.
Yeah. You know what I completely forgot about as well, like that you just mentioned that kind of reminded me of it, is the fact that we actually developed a face tracking software that would count views based on if there's a face present. And
oh man.
Oh
yeah,
my
I do
God.
remember that now.
Yeah, and like that was such a huge challenge because these cameras were so shitty. And it was to the point where I had to figure out what camera sensor was like, because each device, even if they're from the same company, like Lenovo, for instance, and from the same SKU, like from the same exact tablet, they could have different cameras at these lower end things. So one camera in the same device could have slightly better performance than another camera, and that could affect my tracking script. So I had to write my tracking script with like variables in mind where I could like actually tweak it live and have it perform slightly better in different lighting. That was nuts. Like this was a huge step in our careers and our capabilities from where we were 3 years ago to the point where like I think that again, this is another thing that propelled us to be able to take on harder and harder projects.
And like my role at this project, so Mike, you stayed with it for I think maybe 2 years longer than I did, but because in the beginning, and this ties directly into the Chrome app we did, was in the beginning, I was there for sort of the IT role. So I had been recently, I was recently working in IT. And so just a few years prior. And so I was there for the IT role. Specifically, I was there for Chromebooks and Chrome devices, Chrome OS devices being sort of sourced, distributed, and managed en masse. So effectively like an Active Directory, if you're familiar with that, with Windows computers and other types of computers, if you use different plugins and such, but primarily Windows. Chrome OS also has like a remote manager. And so we were able to like, okay, where do we go? Who do we source these devices from? We actually had like a call with Google. At one point, they directed us to one of their third-party people, which emailed me all the way until last year, which was ridiculous. But anyway, yeah, like we would just basically have devices out there that we would be remote managing. And then there was like, some specific nuances, like what device do they have, right? And things like that. Like, how do we ship these devices to these people? Or how are we doing the deployment? So are we doing a remote deployment, or are we shipping the devices to the office and then configuring them and then shipping them to clients? Is a direct ship? Like, what is the situation there? So we did that for a while. And then we started using another kiosk software, which I assisted with a little bit, which was called Moki. I don't know if it's still around, but it was called Moki. And it was a kiosk software that I think IKEA and a few other larger businesses used. And that worked pretty good. It worked pretty good, but I forget the reason why we stopped using it. I think just the app changed or something. I don't remember.
They still use it.
Oh, they still use it. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Moki.
All right,
Moki is the one that they settled on, yeah, I believe.
Okay, so I set them up for life. No. But no, I helped with the initial research and the initial setup and the first on-location deployment of Moki. And then I kind of moved on to, what I do now, which is like small to medium business sites.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And this was a long project that spanned 4 years, I think. Yeah, 4 years. 4 years of 2 years, I think, of Matt's time, 4 years of my time. I was initially, I think I was more part-time, but eventually I was full-time on this project for multiple different verticals. I got more of like a tech lead role on it and stuff like that. Anyway, it was a big one. And it has the interesting thing is that after we left and after it was done, it was still running without any maintenance for several years, which was a good sign for us. So being like, okay, we wrote good enough code. Even though we were learning, again, we were learning on the job and hacking stuff together, we wrote good enough code that it was able to run with Matt's setup of Moki, with the code that we wrote for the devices being long running and resetting and all that. It was on these shitty devices, it was still running in 2021, 2022 for sure. I don't know now, I haven't checked, but it was. With that, same company, Content Link, the next project that we did with them was a optical demo app for a large corporation. I put this here because it's a completely different project, and this was my first step into Vue.js / just in general JavaScript framework land. Before, again, I was a huge proponent of, hey, let's only use vanilla JavaScript. jQuery was kind of a caveat because it was just a expansion of vanilla JavaScript. But here is where I was like, okay, all these frameworks, React is coming, and oh, look, Vue.js is also here. I might look into that. And we built out this application, which was an app where people could check out different demonstrations for glasses that, for instance, anti-reflective coating. How does it look? What does it do? You had a little slider that showed before or after. You had different apps where the transitions, hey, how does the transition work when you go outside or when you come inside? How does it work in the car, et cetera, where you would auto there was just a animation that would run depending on different times of day and stuff like that you can click. So it was a very interactive tablet application that allowed a optician who was trying to sell someone glasses demonstrate different features to the user, to the client, to the buyer. And this was done for a large corporation. I'm not going to name the corporation, but suffice to say that they had over 1,000 locations where we were doing it, and this was being done for them. So that was another challenge that we had to do, is that this is a huge rollout. This is the first time we had to do a major rollout rather than little batch rollouts that we were doing for the digital asset manager before. What we learned here, Vue.js, that was the biggest one probably. In general, not just Vue.js, but a reactive framework, how to use a reactive framework rather than just vanilla.js. That was a huge learning. And then the next thing is that working with large corporations. This is a whole other world. I haven't used this particular skill too often, but it has come up and been helpful in certain situations. But essentially communicating with a large corporation, totally different than startups or smaller corporations. It's just everything is extremely slow. Everything has to go through many rounds of approvals. All the decision makers are scared to make decisions. There's a million different stakeholders for every project, and that comes with challenges upon challenges that we'll talk about. And the first challenge here is compliance. So with a large corporation like this, when you roll something out, it matters very much how you store your data. It matters very much where that data is going, how it's being transferred, and every little bit of your communication with their platform how it's going to be on-prem, on device, how it's going to be on their servers, your servers. All of that is audited immediately and has to go through many security reviews. And these security reviews can take months without any exaggeration. Any sort of revisions that they request could take months. So everything has to be taken very slowly and be very deliberate. You need certifications like HIPAA compliance if you're going to be storing any sort of data, or even if you're going to be interacting with stored data. So you need certifications, and it's just very difficult to work with a lot of time with these large corporations. The other challenge was because we were rolling out on iOS devices now, we were rolling out on iPads specifically. We were working with Safari web views, which are arguably even worse than Android web views. Safari web views have the same issues where they don't have feature parity with the Safari browser. They don't update with the Safari browser, and they just have different standards based on the iOS version and different limitations. Like there's just a lot you can't do, or you, at least back in 2019, I should be clear, you couldn't do with a Safari browser that you could do, a Safari web view with a Safari browser. So that was a huge challenge that we had to work around. And that was a couple of things where we had to like scramble and fix on site sometimes, especially when we were doing demonstrations that just didn't work. And yeah, and the final challenge again is corporations. Large corporations are very difficult to work with. Just getting everyone aligned, and the politics involved internally with the people trying to best each other and take each other's jobs is outrageous. And would I ever like do it again from a perspective of if I had a choice? Probably not. I don't think that it's a good environment to put yourself in from a development perspective, because it's going to slow you down from many different reasons. And it's probably going to, unless you have the perfect contacts within the company, they're probably going to screw you around for a long time. Whether you get a payout or not is a question mark as well. So just in general, I'm pretty proud of what we were able to accomplish, because we were able to do the first initial rollout before we stopped working on this project, which was already a huge challenge, but it was a learning experience more than anything.
I distinctly remember you talking to some individuals in the company for, I want to say like 2 to 3 weeks, just trying to figure out the process that they had from their internal IT to publish an app. And technically you guys were contractors, so like you had to like go through all these different hoops, but there was like one hoop that didn't exist yet, meaning there wasn't a process for it. And you're like, well, we've passed these other, whatever, 10 hoops, like 10 hoops, whatever. We've already gone through all these checks. What do we want to do here? And it was just sort of like, well, there is no, and that was said at the end of the process. Because it's once you get big, it becomes like, there's no emotion there. It's not like, man, we really got to get this done. It's, yeah, but there is no way to get it done though. So then we can't continue. And there's no sympathizing, or very little sympathizing of like, hey, let's make an exception here. It's like, what do you mean by an exception? Like there's no way to proceed because there is no process, and new processes haven't been made in 10 years. So therefore you can't continue. Even though from a technical perspective you could, it's just, well, no, like you must enter the door walking upside down. And if you cannot do that, then therefore you can't enter the building. Like, what do you mean? It is forbidden. And I remember you dealing with that for a number of weeks. And then you ended up like having to get a bunch of contacts. I remember you like, I distinctly remember you gave up at one point because it was just like, that's it. And so you just told everybody. You like sent them a huge email, and you basically just told them like, unfortunately, due to this, and you had a bunch of proofs, this cannot continue. Unfortunately, this project is dead in the water or something. I remember it was like really dramatic, but like not really dramatic. Like it was a dramatic email, but it was all like completely justified. It wasn't even exaggerating. It was just like, I don't know if you remember that, Mike. You probably do. Or you wrote like, I remember you were super exhausted for like a couple of weeks, and like not even like sleep exhausted, just sort of like you're in these meetings clearly with bureaucrats where it's like, yeah, but like we want the doors painted red without using red paint. And when you're done doing that, the doors need to be purple. You can't start with purple paint. And also we can't use paint. It's like, oh dear. Oh, what do we do now? And so you just like sent this huge email out, and you're just like, that's it. It's over. And then eventually like someone higher up was like, okay, that's it. We're starting a new process, or we're doing this and that, or like we can't have this project blocked. And you're just like, well, I don't know. Like I've done it. Like I've done what you asked. I jumped through 10 hoops. The 11th hoop it's over. The 11th hoop doesn't exist. We have to have an 11th hoop. We have to walk through the door upside down, and we have to have, paint without paint. So it's over. It's over. Sorry, guys, unfortunately. And you know what's funny? I do that. I do that even to this day. I did that even before that. Is when things start getting all convoluted, I'm like, no worries, the ball's in your court. And then I turn into a bureaucrat. Unfortunately, due to Section 4, subsection A, further subsection I, we cannot proceed due to the paperwork here. Well, we must proceed, unfortunately, due to section, just repeat it over and over again, throw it in their court. Or you do the classic, like, what's the solution to this? And you just pass it off and you walk away and you log out for a few hours too, while that person panics. Because unfortunately, like sometimes that's how office politics works. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, so this particular moment that you're mentioning was a very big learning moment for me, actually. I tried every which way to work with the team. I can't remember exactly what we needed to do, but we needed access to a machine, like a virtual machine of some sorts. I tried every which way to work with the IT team to get the access. And like you said, I sent them, like, I did every possible hoop. And essentially, like, what they landed on was, like, I think I needed to be on premise to be able to access the virtual machine, but the virtual machine cannot be accessed on premise. And that was the message I got back. Like, just in clear English, saying, like, giving me a catch-22. And at that point, like, it had already been weeks, and I was done with it. And I just did the CC game. I just CC'd someone 10 steps above them. And I sent them that email that Matt was just mentioning that outlined every point that I tried to make. And about 3 hours after I sent that email, everything was unblocked. So sometimes, like, I gave them every out I possibly could without having to do that. I literally think that it's the worst thing you can do is, like, play the CC game, like CC someone way above someone in an email. That is a shitty thing to do. Pure shit. Like, terrible work ethic. I gave them every out I possibly could for me not to do that. But unfortunately, when you're working with these massive corporations, sometimes you just have to go above heads. And I mean, when I say above heads, not one step above heads, you have to go way above to, like, vice presidents and presidents. That's the only way to get shit done, because all the middle managers are just as useless as everyone else. And it's so tough. Like, it is such a difficult environment to work in.
I remember like having to do it, and what sucks is you know what, actually, let me reclassify it, is the CC game really sucks, but I would say once you've hit your point, it no longer becomes the game. It becomes, like, what you need to do at that point. So, like, when people, kind of hit a small snag and they start CCing everybody, that's like a game, and that's like some, corporate, office politics nonsense trying to get you in trouble, almost, in a way. It's almost like telling the teacher or something like that sometimes, depending on the situation. That really sucks. But in your case, I wouldn't even say it was a game. That's it. Like, the reason why people CC higher up people is for that reason. Like, it should be, you went through the 10 steps and then you hit that catch-22, and it's like, is there any way around this? Unfortunately, and then they just, like, repeat the catch-22. It's like, okay, I have to go. Like, it's mandatory that I go above you. It's mandatory that you go around. Like, you have to. Because, like, what else? Like, you know what I mean? At that point, you're not even playing a game. At that point, you're just trying to get your job done. What do you do?
I didn't know.
You must drive a car without driving.
Yeah. Yeah. It was literally some sort of ridiculous. Yep.
Like, Kate, I'm calling the transit authority. Like, it's over. Like, I'm calling somebody. Like wait.
I completely blocked that out until you brought it up too. So now it's the trauma is right back up.
Whew. It sucks. Like, I mean, the way I learned that type of thing was I mean, like very small bit of story time, but I remember I had to report in a ticket that one of our vendors, which is a third party vendor, and this is not at this company, this was a previous working environment, but I had to basically make a ticket as a notification that there was going to be some work done on some sort of fiber line or something. There was going to be maintenance done. And I filled in all the paperwork and everything. And it basically, like, I had a back and forth of this ticket, which needed to be approved, just would not get approved. And so they said, unfortunately, maintenance cannot continue. I said, unfortunately, it's a third party. They're not going to listen to me. They're not going to listen to the co-op in row one, co-op 1 of 1 billion. They're not going to listen to me. Unfortunately, they're not going to do it. And so I tried to, like, bounce those ideas off the team at the time. And they were, well, try this, try that, tried everything. Try that. And so that was the day I just sat there and I learned to put the ball in their court. I basically just said, unfortunately, this is a third party change and therefore we must have a ticket. And you're saying we cannot have a ticket. How do we get a ticket based upon your parameters? And like once that happened, they came over to my desk. It was a classic. They came over to my desk. We had a chat and it was like, okay, well, if we do this and this, I suppose we could approve it. I'm like, cool, because even if you don't, then there's just going to be an outage and no one's going to know. So which one, which one are we going to do? So that's where I learned that. And so like, I have like that switch. I'm sure you, Mike, you now have that switch, but there always is a ridiculous situation that generates that switch where I just become a bureaucrat. I'm like, no worries. Let me get the manual out. Like, I don't want to do this. Like, I don't want to be the jerk, but I'm getting the manual out. I'm getting the CCs ready. Like, what else do you want me to do?
You just have to become an asshole. No, you just have to become an asshole. That's the thing.
Which
you don't
sucks.
have to be aggressive about it, but you have to be an asshole sometimes, and it's really unfortunate. But yeah, that's the reality of especially corporate world, especially the corporate world. I can be very clear on that.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yep. And yeah, so the next one here kind of coincides with where I was at that time. So like Matt said, he kind of broke off at around this time where I was working on this optical retail corporate mess app. Matt broke off onto another side. So I'll let Matt tell his part here.
Trying to cover more ground because we're just running a little agency. So I decided to work with a company. And so what I started doing was I'll actually even outline the prequel to what's on the list here. So on the list here, I have around 2020, I did a fast food franchise website for a major fast food chain. However, before that, what led me to this is I worked for a sports website. So I did some research for this sports website. We kind of went from, complete infant of an idea, like the idea of like what was going to be covered. Is it news? Is it this? Is it that? What is this company was kind of being figured out. And as a part of that, my job was to research a CMS that kind of ticked a whole bunch of boxes. So I was given about 15 or 30 or something like that parameters. And I was, sent out into the world to do the research into, which CMS checked all, or at the very least, the most of the boxes. The one that we landed on was Webflow because this particular client, ticked a lot of the boxes, but the really big ones were that he liked to kind of have phone calls and then have changes done on the fly. And I found Webflow really easy to do that in. So I ended up learning Webflow. And then that led me down sort of the path and sort of solidified me into the small to medium business game. So I ended up working again for this fast food franchise website. Now, again, you're going to say, well, you just said it was a major fast food restaurant. Why is it that, you're saying it's medium to small business? It's because in this particular case, I'm only doing the marketing side. So I'm not doing, the customer facing, hey, order food from here. I'm doing, realistically, the medium business part of the business, if you will, which is for the marketing side of things for franchisees specifically. So this site was designed to sort of present and attract information regarding, franchisee information. So like, hey, this is how much you got to pay, this is how much of this and that. And it was meant to attract entrepreneurs to open up their own franchise location based on this information. We had success stories on there, testimonials. We had clearly laid out, this is how the company has grown since this time. This is that. And we actually ended up working with the person that ran the sports website. We ended up working with that person on this as well for a number of months for sure. I don't know if it was a number of years. But we ended up, shipping the site, and then we've worked with them periodically, maybe once a year-ish approximately, to do little changes. Like, hey, our company's grown, we need to do this. Hey, we need to update, pricing, but it's, completely changed, right? There's no longer 3 tiers. We want this whole site or this whole page redesigned. I also did some interactivity stuff. So they had some, they had like a custom map. They had different custom locations. And so I did a lot of Webflow stuff, of course, but I ended up doing quite a bit of custom work, like custom JavaScript, custom, things like that. And what I learned actually was a lot of Webflow stuff. Like, okay, I'm using Webflow really, I don't know if I would say to the max by today's standard, because there's been a lot of features added, but to the max in 2020. I was using Webflow a lot. I was also learning how to interact with stuff. So, we had interacted, like Mike said earlier, with an HTML and CSS template, and then using Couch CMS. This was like, using sort of a live platform that's constantly updating and having my custom code interact in a safe way where hopefully, it minimizes the chances of whenever Webflow updates, my code doesn't break. And so I did that for, a while, and we made custom maps, we made them accessible. We made it so that it would work with a touch screen, had accessible controls for zooming in, things like that. And that was all custom. And then I had it interact with Webflow wherever possible in order to allow the people to actually edit things, which was good, which was a good experience. One of the things is when you work in an industry like this, fast food, especially franchises, are very competitive. And so we had to go and take a look and go, okay, what are the competitors ranking at? Specifically, not SEO stuff. That's their department, right? They write the blogs, they do whatever they do. But in terms of speed, like, can we make our site faster? And we did. We made our site faster or on par than all of the immediate competitors at the time. So I learned, with that, how to really optimize a Webflow site. So learned a lot about image stuff, whereas before I was just sort of compressing things. I knew PNG, I knew JPEG, I knew WebP, and WebP was kind of the newfangled one at the time. I know right now it's AVIF or whatever it is, but WebP was the big thing at the time. And so it became like, okay, let's really learn how to optimize this stuff. Let's really get into page speed insights, circa 2020, and really make a nice experience. And so we were able to obtain, get everything out of the red, a lot of the pages onto the green in both mobile and desktop. I don't know how it stacks up today, but circa 2020, we were, miles ahead of many of our competitors. And I think we were on par with one of them, and on par with them on the homepage. I think the rest of the pages we were ahead of them. So, that is something else I learned where it's these people are, a direct competitor. When you work with someone, B2B, business to business, it's very common that they have competitors. Makes sense. But in this particular case, it was very much we're competing with those people. Like we were kind of at a business war, if you will. We got to watch what they do because we got to, react one-to-one and quickly kind of thing. So that was a part of it. So that was kind of a cool experience as well. The challenges with this project, actually one more thing I learned and this was very time sensitive. This was a COVID thing. So I'll just touch on it briefly because I know people are sick about hearing about it. But this was, Mike and I were used to at this point, working remote. However, in our jurisdiction, we were considered essential service, meaning we could continue to work in full capacity because we're in IT/tech. And the food industry, obviously this is a restaurant thing, the food industry was also considered essential. So there was a few meetings where they had to be moved around more logistically, not violently or anything, more logistically being hey, come into the office and let's meet the new guy, meet this person that we just hired. And I'm we probably shouldn't do that. This can be done over Zoom. This can be done over Teams, things like that. So we had a bit of that. So it was learning to interact with, a team that was largely used to working in person like they were. And then, we kind of worked together and made things kind of work remotely. And so that was just sort of a learning experience, very time sensitive, but also a good prep for sort of async work, which is more common today. So some of the challenges, the COVID thing was what I learned, but also a challenge. I already kind of mentioned that. So I'll just touch on that. So in-person workflow challenges, more or less, right? Just, hey, can you come in? Okay, do we need to come in at this point? We're legally allowed to, but should we be doing that? What can we do in person? What can't we? And I ended up, I think, coming in once or twice, I want to say, for a couple meetings here and there. But it was, we kind of worked around each other's sort of thoughts and ideas in that regard. We had a lot of floating timelines. So again, we were talking about, I presume, and this was even obfuscated from me, I presume competitors making moves, and then I would get a call and it's hey, we need to make a change here. And I assume that's probably because the competitor has made a move and then we have to make a move too. So floating timelines. I was going to say scope creep. It's not even usually scope creep. It's usually hey, rip that page out and build this other one instead kind of thing. So it's just sort of scope change, I guess you could say. So, or requirements change is probably it. So I was working, a fair bit with that. In this particular, I don't know if it's common in this industry or what, but there was a lot of staff changes. I know a lot of places changed staff during COVID, so maybe it was even that. But there's a lot of staff changes. So I was working with, again, that person that I'd worked with prior. That person leaves. I work with someone else. That person leaves. And I'm not a part of the staff, so I don't get informed of this. So I start talking back and forth, and they would get back to me usually within about a week. That was our working relationship. And it would take weeks and weeks, and I wouldn't hear back. And then I would go to touch base with someone else that I knew just to be hey, is that person still there? So, and in most cases, that person would answer, no, we have a new person. Here's their email. Or in one case, that other person was gone. I had to go reach out to someone else. And so lots of staff changes, a lot of turnover, which I presume is relatively common in that industry. And also we had some responsibility confusion for sure. And this was a point of contention, and a big challenge was they were having some corporate email issues. And one of the staffers there was basically like, yo, you need to fix this. And I was like, I don't, like, call your IT company. I didn't set it up. I don't know where it is, whatever. And they were adamant, like, this is your struggle. You're trying to get out of it. And I'm like, no, you really don't understand. I've been here for like 2 weeks. It is really not my problem. I don't even know where to look. And it's like, well, you should know where to look. And it became that game of like, this is your responsibility. You don't know what you're doing. Clearly this isn't. I got called a scammer at one point, and it was a really awkward meeting we had with this person. And like it got solved amicably in the end, but it was a big mess. And then just some, normal logistics confusion, which was like analytics, where, we didn't need analytics, then we did. And then we were managing the analytics, but then things changed probably on their side, legally speaking. So then they had to take it over, but they weren't sure how to do that. And they thought they could just take it from me, but I couldn't do that. And so we had to figure those things out. So just like kind of working in really like an agile environment and remotely was sort of the real big takeaway from this. But this was our first sort of like really big Webflow project. Like the sports thing was at the time was a hobby of the person. So it was very like, done as a hobby, done here and there, change things here and there, not that many changes. Whereas like this was like, the first Webflow project where it's like, okay, like this is serious. Like we have to make sure accessibility, we have to watch the competitors, the list goes on, as I've already said. And so that was sort of my experience with that. And, from here, I've split into a lot of no code stuff. Webflow, obviously, is still a thing. WordPress, still a thing. I just said, and this is code, but I just did a big couch CMS thing for somebody, just a big update on an old site that they weren't ready to replace. So I just, did an update to it and I updated their CMS so they could edit some stuff. And they have a whole new page and a whole new system on something. I can't remember exactly now, but so this is like kind of like the break off point where like that hobby site led me down this road. And now this is kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's good to point that out. Is like, again, we kind of broke off, but we're still working in the same business, same thing, but just different avenues. And that's what can happen to you. Like you shouldn't lock yourself into one. Like if we had locked ourselves into Chrome apps, we would be screwed. Like Chrome apps aren't as popular anymore and there's just not as much work there. So you need to be able to pivot. You need to be able to go on different paths depending on what comes at you, build on your experience from before. And the final thing I have here is kind of what led me to where I am at right now, which is I'm working at a Web3 security company. And I'm managing an entire team of developers and also developing a bunch of stuff there. And I'm doing that with SvelteKit. And in 2021, kind of, I guess, peak COVID, after all the stuff with the corporate websites and stuff ended and Content Link ended, I moved on to something new. And this was another opportunity where it's like, okay, well, Web3 is a big thing now. There was a good contact that I had that was working on this little NFT project that was these little robots called Solarians. There's the cool pixelated robots. I didn't know anything about NFTs. I don't really care about NFTs right now as well. Like I'm not an NFT investor. Even during this time, I didn't really care. But what interested me in the project was the fact that I was going to be interacting with Solana, which is an interesting new chain, interesting new technology. I was going to be kind of playing around with a lot of canvas stuff because essentially what the project was is like you pull all the NFTs from a person's wallet into the website, into a regular like website. And the NFTs are a little bit animated. They move up and down. They're little GIFs, little pixelated robot GIFs. And then it allows the user to be able to put items on their NFTs and then share those images with others. So like the items are also animated and move up and down. So there was a lot of challenges that I saw there that were really interesting. I got to use Svelte, which was something that I was just learning at the time, playing around with, and I really enjoyed. And I got to kind of run the project and kind of build a small team to help me build out a few different apps, not just the changing room. The changing room was just the first app. And yeah, so what I learned was, again, SvelteKit was an amazing full stack framework, kind of completely changed the game for me on how to build apps in general. And it's something I still use today. Web3 was interesting to work in from a shallow level. Like I wasn't building any smart contracts or building anything on the blockchain, but interacting with the blockchain was new. It was a different kind of experience to just interacting with the database. You had to account for many different things, private keys and all that with wallets, connecting to a wallet, different way to sign in, which was interesting to me. Communities, dealing with the Web3 communities was kind of a weird one where like they're at one point extremely excited, at one point extremely toxic. They're very much bipolar. And that was a completely new experience for me. I wasn't really in communities a lot at the time. So That was a big learning that I had that I still kind of take to this day. And just general crypto knowledge. Like I had no idea about cryptocurrency prior to 2021. Like I wasn't interested in it as much. And here I was just kind of forced into it through technology. And a bunch of people there were kind of teaching me how to do it, like how to onboard into Solana, how to onboard into Ethereum, what it is and stuff like that. And I know like a lot of it is still kind of useless, and that I know, like, everyone in the industry should acknowledge that. But it is an interesting identity technology that could be something in the future. So, and it was something completely new to me at the time, and I found it cool. And because of that, again, I went into that niche, I was able to get the next role, which is the role that I'm at today. And hopefully that builds into the next role and the next role, whatever that may be. But that's the point of this discussion, right? So like the challenges from this one, Web3 and Solana were new, and the documentation was non-existent. Like it was shit. It was terrible. It was better to have no documentation at all. So I had to do a ton of guesswork, a ton of figuring out how to interact with these chains, a ton of like watching people do it on YouTube and then trying to like copy them and figuring out that they were doing it on an older version. Like there was just a lot of that kind of trial and error, even in this industry. Working with GIFs was actually pretty hard. So just being able to like take apart a GIF into separate images, recreate the GIF with the images, like the actual items on top of it in a canvas, and then animate it all perfectly. That was a pretty big challenge. I never dealt with Canvas as much at the time. I did a little bit of Canvas with camera stuff, but I never did like this kind of Canvas, and especially didn't deal with GIFs. So that was a really cool experiment that I did, and that worked out and works. I think it works to this day. And then the other challenge was the Web3 communities. It's kind of tough to be like really enjoying the work when the community is extremely toxic. And that was kind of the situation in some of the things. Like price goes up, price goes down. That all affects the community because they're all invested in this project. It's all an investment to them. It's not really an interesting like little toy. It's like, hey, how am I going to get my money back? And if price goes down, everyone's toxic. If price goes up, everyone's happy. It's just a weird bipolar nature, not super conducive to a good work environment. So like that was another good learning for me, but it was a challenge. But
it's almost like the chaos of like the Wall Street floor.
Kind of, yeah, exactly. And that, in a very macro or micro sense, I guess. Like it's very interesting. I'm glad I did it. And the people that I worked with, the team that we had there was really cool. Like I liked them a lot. It's just, as with the community, it's not easy. But that's it. That's it for me. Like that's where from there I went to the next role, and it was where I'm at right now. And that's my journey. Like that's, I think, Matt's journey, my journey, that's where we're at. And hopefully it continues. It's been 10 years. So
yeah, I think like if I were to reflect, well, I mean, I did a tiny bit on Solarians too. I like helped you with a couple of CSS things. I remember a couple times.
Yes.
A couple of consulting.
100%.
But like, it's just a good representation of, we did go different directions to cover more of the industry. And that's kind of where we're at. Like I'm doing a huge thing in Web3 in Webflow right now for marketing teams. So it's like, we're getting sort of the coverage. I just built a really big site and they just asked for more enhancements for a local brand as well. So it's like a big thing. So there's that. But I think that like, kind of looking back on these projects, I think one of the big things to sort of consider or think about in reflection and moving forward is I feel like we want to build something for ourselves again, kind of thing. Like I feel like we kind of talk very passionately about that time where we had, the Chrome app, Clicks to Riches, and there was a precursor to that, a small one called List by Design, which was sort of a productivity app and like a bookmarks kind of esque thing where you would make like a big list and it would automatically put the link in, so you could make like shopping lists and things like that, which is now delisted, I believe. But like I just feel like that is like where we're thinking. Like, if time ever presents itself, I feel like that's what we're going to try to do. Whether it, makes $1 million, whether it makes $5, I feel like we're, our passion lies at this point, and we're going to be much more capable from a technical skills perspective. We're going to be much more capable of building something that's like more impressive in a shorter amount of time. We're not going to be sitting there wondering how the text wrap works. Like we're not going to worry about that. We know how, I know how animations work in CSS and stuff, like animations and transitions and stuff like that. Mike, like you're more full stack now, so you can kind of go all over the place. You even have Web3 stuff. So like, we could do something Web3, which scares me, to be honest, because I've never done it. So everything, typical human, like scared of everything. But no, like I think, I don't know if you have any comments on that, Mike, but I feel like, all these, like this has been our path so far. This is our, our greatest hits, or even like a collection of our greatest hits. It's not every single thing that we did. and we've had tons of experiences over the years, but I feel like we had the most fun and that type of thing when we were building something for us, which is partially why we do this podcast, partially why we have the site, that type of thing. But, to have something out there where you're like, yo, I built, whatever, blah, blah, blah.com. I built this, it's a cool tool, whether it's everyone, freaking uses it or everyone doesn't. I want people to look at it and go, oh, that's cool. Right. And it's like, yeah, I built that. I own that. I do this. I feel like that is sort of like where we would lean in a utopian world. If money was no object, if time was no object, I feel like that's where we would lean. I don't know if you have any insights into that, but
I 100% agree. I think that the audience will be able to tell as well from the passion that we talked about during the Clicks to Riches segment. And that's probably what we want to do next is another something where we want to do. But again, like Matt said, I have a family now. I have a child. He has, we're moving up in our careers. We're moving up in our life. And we're just we're at a point where we can't take $0 to make Clicks to Riches in a basement. We need to balance that out with actual work. But the ideal situation for us, 100%, is being able to build stuff for ourselves or for the audience and be able to just do what we build what we want. Because I still love to build. That's the thing. I'm not going to ever probably not want to build things, build tools, build apps, build websites. That's something that's probably never going to change. It's just, I would love to do it for myself rather than another company. I'm glad that the company I'm working right now gives me a lot of ownership to do a lot of stuff, but it's still not the same as building it for yourself, obviously.
Yeah, I've had this conversation with other people, and when you get off work, you just, for lack of a better way to say, you just sort of bitch about things with people. Everyone does it, right? They kind of vent, you kind of vent, whatever. Even if it was a great day, you're just gonna kind of vent about random stuff or at least talk about it. And I was having this conversation with somebody the other day, and it was you never hear me complain about the tech. You always hear me complain about the people emailing you, and when you say, hey, I'm unavailable at 2, and they're like, man, it's 2. I better friggin' send an urgent email. Stupid things like that. It just, I always complain about the people logistics, if you will, the whatever. I rarely complain about the actual tech. I don't go man, this CMS sucks, or this software sucks, or whatever. Occasionally, certainly if something is a particular pain point. So it's still, it'd be cool to build again. And obviously I'm building right now. I've been building for a long, long time, but it'd be cool to build something cool. And I feel like that's what Full Stack Struggles really was. But then, again, this is a non-utopian thing. So it's I could either spend time making money, or I could spend time learning something that I'm not going to immediately use. So I may as well, quite literally, do I make thousands of dollars, or do I make this, other side thing? And it's sort of and then also make a podcast about it. It's a challenge, and it is a problem. And it's one of the reasons why I feel like we've stopped promising things so much. We'll be yeah, for sure. In 3 weeks, we'll have this thing, for you guys in the community. We'll have this. No, probably not. So if anything else comes up that either is for a client in an emergency state, or is, something one of us is on vacation, or this or that, things are going to come up now. And so it's a bit of a, I don't want to say catch-22, but it's sort of we work on a rolling priority is kind of the thing. That, if we have a bunch of free time for 3 weeks for whatever reason, because a company shut down or something, it's okay, maybe we could spend time doing something that we think is valuable, but, may not make any money. But it is a far cry from the basement days of well, let's just do this. And then we were happy that we made $40. We're man, people bought this thing. 40 people bought this app. It's it's not that many. It's not that many people. But it was still cool. So yeah, I don't know. The grass is always greener, I suppose. Now that we're making money, it's sort of well, remember those days when we didn't? And then when we're not making money, it'd be man, remember when we made money? It's partly that too, the human experience, if you will. But I think, unless you have anything else to add, Mike, I think that's it. That's the conclusion.
I think that's it. Yeah.
All right. Well, remember, if you want to, share your experience, share your pathway to becoming a developer. Did you have any cool big projects or anything like that? Let us know. And you can let us know. I'm on Threads and Instagram under HTML All the Things, and Mike is at HTML Everything on X. You can go check that out. And if you want to support episodes like this, remember we are on Patreon. That's patreon.com/HTML All the Things. Check out the tiers and give that a go. Many thanks to our $3 tier patrons: Tim from the Web Hacker and thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Joshua via silvio.us, and Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. And last but not least, we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on htmlallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.